They were never meant to be seen by the outside world. For generations, they lived hidden, buried deep in the folds of rural America, where the hills are thick with silence and the air carries secrets older than the families themselves. What began as isolation became something else, entirely a cycle of blood, madness, and survival that defied everything we think we know about humanity. When the camera first found them, it wasn't discovery. It was intrusion, a trespass into a lineage that time had forgotten and decency had abandoned. Their faces, when captured, told a story no words could prepare you for. The deformities, the grunts instead of speech, the wild eyes that didn't quite meet yours. It was a portrait of what happens when nature is denied diversity, when blood turns inward, again and again, until it collapses under its own weight. The locals knew of them long before the cameras ever came. They whispered of a family that lived beyond the tree line, a place children were warned never to go. Sometimes, late at night, a scream would echo across the valley. Animal, yet not quite. Hunters spoke of seeing shapes move through the brush, moving on all fours. It became a local legend, a story to scare outsiders away. But legends are built on truth, and this one was no different. When a documentarian finally dared to step into their world, he wasn't just entering a family home. He was walking into a living museum of generational decay. Every blink of the camera revealed another piece of a puzzle no one wanted to finish. You could almost feel the centuries pressing down, the long line of shared bloodlines looping back on themselves like a serpent devouring its own tail. This isn't just about one family. It's about what happens when isolation breeds not just deformity, but darkness. When love, fear, and survival fuse into something unrecognizable. And somewhere, buried in the silence of those mountains, there's a truth even more disturbing than their appearance. They didn't choose this life, but they became the living proof of what happens when humanity forgets the cost of staying hidden too long. When the documentarian arrived, he expected resistance. Instead, what greeted him was silence, a heavy, unnatural kind of quiet that seemed to press in from every direction. The dirt road leading to their home was barely a road at all, just a scar through the trees, leading deeper into a land that didn't want to be found. He later said that as he walked, the forest itself felt watchful. The air was thick, the kind that makes you whisper without knowing why. And then he saw them. The first figure emerged from behind a broken-down vehicle, barefoot, clothes hanging in tatters. The man didn't speak, only grunted, a sound halfway between curiosity and warning. His eyes darted back toward the house, and from the shadows, more faces appeared. Faces that seemed both human and not. Twisted features, wide-set eyes, mouths that struggled to form words, but tried anyway. The camera kept rolling, almost on instinct. What he captured that day would become one of the most unsettling pieces of footage ever recorded in rural America. It wasn't violent. It wasn't dramatic. It was something worse. An intimate look at the slow disintegration of a bloodline trapped by its own isolation. Inside their home, the walls sagged under the weight of years. The furniture was rotted, the air heavy with dust and something older, something alive. Family photos hung on the walls, but they didn't look like milestones of joy. They looked like warnings. The same faces, again and again, generation after generation. Eyes that mirrored each other too perfectly, smiles that never reached them. The interviewer tried to speak, to ask simple questions, but words dissolved in the air. The family's responses came in sounds, clicks, hums, and gestures. Communication had devolved into instinct. You could see the effort in their faces, the yearning to connect, but the capacity had been eroded, passed down through generations of closed doors and shared blood. When he finally stepped back outside, the sun had begun to set, and the mountains swallowed the light like a secret. He said later that it felt as if he'd stepped out of time itself, as though that family existed in a parallel thread of history, one America had chosen to ignore. The footage would soon spread across the internet, and with it came a storm. Fascination, disgust, pity. But no one seemed to ask the real question. How did they end up like this? Their story began long before the cameras arrived, before modern America, before asphalt roads carved through those hills. The bloodline traced back to the early settlers who came seeking land, freedom, and escape. But the isolation they found became a curse. The nearest town was miles away, and as generations passed, the outside world faded into myth. They farmed the same soil, married the same names, and buried their dead in the same patch of earth. At first, it was survival. The winters were brutal, the land unforgiving. Outsiders rarely came that far into the wilderness. So when it came time to choose partners, choices were few. Cousins became lovers, siblings bore children, and slowly, the blood grew thin. What began as a means of staying alive became the very thing that twisted them. Local records show that their surname appears over and over again in birth and death registries dating back to the 1800s. No new names, no marriages beyond their valley. It's as if time looped in on itself. The genetic damage accumulated quietly, hidden beneath generations of secrecy. Some were born without the ability to speak, others with physical deformities so severe that leaving home became impossible. The few who did venture out were met with cruelty, taunted, gawked at, treated like monsters. So they retreated further, built walls not of stone, but of fear. The family grew inward, and with each generation, the line blurred between choice and confinement. Parents raised children who didn't understand there was a world beyond the forest. Their concept of family became both shelter and prison. By the mid-1900s, the last link to the outside world was gone. Mail stopped coming. Roads washed out and were never repaired. The government forgot them, the church abandoned them, and the land took them back. They lived off scraps, small crops, and animals that wandered too close. What's most haunting isn't just the deformities or the madness. It's the innocence. The way some of them smiled at the camera, unaware of how the world would see them. They didn't know they were different. To them, this was just life. Normal. The only reality they had ever known. And maybe that's what makes it so tragic. Because the true horror wasn't born in their house. It came from the world that left them there. When the footage was first released, it was treated like a sideshow. People shared it, laughed, turned it into a grotesque spectacle of curiosity. The internet stripped the humanity out of what it was seeing, turning a family's suffering into entertainment. But behind the clicks and the comments lay something older, a reflection of how society treats its forgotten. The documentarian who filmed them never meant for it to go viral. He said the experience haunted him, that he would wake in the night hearing those guttural sounds echoing in his mind. What disturbed him most wasn't their appearance. It was the feeling that he had looked into the past, into a piece of America that should never have survived this long, and yet somehow did. He described one moment in particular, a little boy, barefoot and silent, sitting in the dirt, staring at a rusted tricycle, too small for him. He couldn't speak, but his eyes followed the documentarian with something that looked almost like pleading. Behind him, his mother, her face warped, her speech reduced to grunts, stood watching, protective but powerless. It wasn't evil he saw there. It was loss. The loss of language, of opportunity, of everything that defines being human. That image, he said, stayed with him longer than anything else, because it forced a question no one wanted to ask. When a family becomes trapped by its own blood, who is truly at fault? Them, or the world that abandoned them to their fate? Experts later weighed in, trying to explain it scientifically. Genetic bottlenecks, recessive traits, mutations. But science can't explain the emotional weight of looking at people who have lived entire lives without understanding the world outside their fence line, who have never heard their own names spoken with kindness. Some of the younger ones, born in the later years, still live out there, half feral, half forgotten. The authorities have tried to intervene. But what can be done when generations of isolation have become the only culture they know? To take them away would be mercy and cruelty both. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The deeper you dig into their history, the more it feels like uncovering a wound that never healed. The oldest surviving records describe the founding ancestor as a veteran of a forgotten war, one who came home broken and withdrawn. He built a shack in those woods to escape the noise of civilization, but what began as solitude became a dynasty of silence. Each generation added another layer to his isolation, until the family no longer remembered what it meant to live among others. Neighbors from nearby towns spoke of strange sounds in the night, shrieks, laughter, sometimes the barking of voices that didn't form words. They'd find dead animals on the outskirts of the forest, gutted but not eaten. For decades, police reports described the area as uninhabitable, but the locals knew better. The family was still there, surviving in the shadows, watching anyone who came too close. A former mail carrier once recalled being followed down the dirt path by unseen eyes. He said it wasn't fear he felt, it was pity. Because when he looked into their world, he saw remnants of what we all could become if stripped of connection. When the documentarian tried to return years later, he found their house half collapsed, nature reclaiming it. The walls were rotting, the floor swallowed by weeds. But the photos were still there, curling at the edges. You could trace the degeneration of the bloodline through those pictures. The faces growing less distinct, the eyes drifting further apart, the smiles fading into nothing. And yet, in one frame, a small miracle, a young woman, her features almost normal, staring at the camera with an expression of defiance. As if she knew she didn't belong there, as if she could feel the weight of generations pressing down and wanted, somehow, to break free. Some say she ran away. Others claim she died before she could escape. But in the family's final years, her name became a whisper among them, a symbol of hope, or perhaps betrayal. When you look at those photos now, you can't help but wonder how many other families like them still hide out there, buried in the forgotten corners of America, clinging to their own private darkness. The more the world learned about them, the more their existence blurred the line between empathy and horror. To most viewers, they were a curiosity, proof that something primal still lurked in the backwoods of America. But to those who truly looked, they became a mirror, because what we fear in them isn't the deformity or the madness, it's the reflection of what isolation can do to all of us. Civilization is fragile. Strip away connection, compassion, and time, and we begin to resemble what we fear most. Inbreeding may have broken their genes, but loneliness broke their humanity. Every generation was born into a smaller world, until language itself disappeared, until the mind began to fold inward, feeding on memory instead of experience. The documentarian's final report, years after his first visit, was never meant for release. In it, he wrote something that still haunts readers to this day. They are not monsters. They are relics of neglect. He described one of the surviving brothers, barely coherent, eyes glassy, sitting in a torn armchair. He had learned to mimic the sounds of animals, barking when strangers approached. But in brief flashes between the noises came fragments of words. Broken, trembling words like, and, mama. The last fragile echoes of language, slipping away. And that's when the horror shifts, when you realize this wasn't just genetic decay, but the slow erasure of consciousness. Generations born without books, without schools, without anyone to tell them they were human. It's one thing to lose health. It's another to lose the very idea of self. Those who've studied the family's case say it reveals how deeply social we are meant to be. That without communication, without new faces, the human mind collapses inward. The results are not evil, just inevitable, like a candle burning with no air. That house is gone now. The woods have swallowed it whole. But sometimes hikers report strange echoes out there, rhythmic sounds, like half-formed voices carried on the wind. Maybe imagination, or maybe remnants of a family that spoke its last words to a camera lens decades ago, not knowing it would make them immortal. In the end, the story of the most inbred family ever caught on camera isn't about freakishness. It's about forgetting. About what happens when people vanish from the map and no one comes looking. We like to think of progress as a straight line, a march forward into light and reason. But the truth is, just beneath that bright surface, there are pockets of shadow where time stands still and blood remembers the past too well. That family was one of those pockets. Their tragedy wasn't born from malice but from neglect, an American story as old as the land itself. Generation after generation, they tried to survive the only way they knew how, even as their world grew smaller and their minds dimmer. The camera didn't discover them. It exposed us. It showed how far we're willing to let suffering exist, so long as it stays out of sight. Today, their name has become a warning, a whisper in documentaries, a clickbait headline, a digital ghost drifting through the archives of the internet. But behind every frame is a truth too heavy to look at directly, that we made them by leaving them behind. The documentarian once said he returned one last time, years after the world had moved on. The house was gone, but the clearing remained, silent, untouched. He placed the camera down where the porch had been and listened. And in the hush of the woods, he thought he heard movement. Not speech, not words. Just breath, just life, stubbornly clinging to its corner of the world. He never released that final footage. Said some things are better left buried, because showing them doesn't help. It only feeds the hunger for spectacle. But in that silence, he found something close to peace. Not forgiveness, not understanding, just the faint comfort of knowing that the earth had reclaimed what the world could not heal. So if you ever find yourself driving down a forgotten road, where the trees grow too close and the air feels heavy, listen closely. Because not every ghost wears chains or whispers names. Some are living, breathing, waiting for the world to remember them. And maybe, in their eyes, you'll see what we were never meant to forget.